we have an abundance of riches today, and it's extraordinary. All good friends of ICUJP, as we enter our 20th year, folks. Can you imagine? This September will be 20 years. We've been at this every Friday morning, except for a few days off for holidays. And we keep at this work because religious communities must stop blessing war and violence. We actually have four speakers eventually today, so it's truly a blessing. I'm not going to take too much time. I do think I'd ask each speaker to weave into their remarks some of what over these 20 years, perhaps, briefly, has brought them to this work, and particularly to the crisis in the Middle East. So I would, I'm not sure there was a pre-existing order of speakers, but our initial invitation was to Kamal and to Estee. As between the two of yourselves, any preference? If one of you would, well, maybe we'll start with Kamal, since he has some time limitations.
It's with Salam, Steve. Salam.
Salam, I'm sorry. So Salam, good morning, welcome. Salam alaikum, and please give us some of your remarks and put us into the immediate crisis in the Middle East.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody. It's good to be with everyone. I feel like I'm always with family, and it's a nice reunion, even if it's on Zoom, because I've known you. I think I've known most of you since the beginning of my work back in the 80s. And that's really when we started. We started in 1991 with the Religious Coalition Against War in the Gulf, with Reverend Regas, Dr. Maher Hattout, Dr. Hassan Hattout, Rabbi Leonard Bierman, Reverend Jim Lawson, and to this day they are the giants whose shoulders we stand upon, and we do this work. And in many ways, the issue of Palestine and the occupation that we're witnessing to this day is the central point, is the crux of the matter when it comes to the Middle East, because everything that happens in the Middle East goes back to what the United States policy is on Palestine and on Israel. And we cannot avoid it. And in many ways, I believe U.S. policymakers are very dismissive of that reality. They look to what's happening in the Gulf as if it's independent, and they look to what's happening in Iran as if it's independent. They look, even Iraq and Syria. No, it's all related to United States policy, mainly on Israel, and its one-sidedness, blindly one-sided with Israel, at the expense of Palestinian human rights. And so in navigating that, I want to debunk some myths about the issue. They call it a Muslim-Jewish conflict, and that is definitely a misnomer. Number one, if not number two and number three, it excludes any presence, any significance, any acknowledgement of Christians in the region. And Christians have been a part of the Middle East as long as, obviously for 2,000 years, longer than Muslims. Some Christians converted to Islam, some Jews converted to Christianity, and some of them converted to Islam. But the reality is Christians have been an integral part of the Middle East, and especially in and around Jerusalem. And we all know that there's been a decline, if not eradication, of the Christian presence. And when we talk about the issue as if Christians don't belong there, are not acknowledged there, I think that in and of itself is a travesty. And there are many Palestinian Christians, of course. I actually have attended some dialogues with evangelical churches, whether you believe it or not. I sat with some evangelical leaders in Phoenix and in Orange County, and it was interesting. And I noticed that among, especially the younger evangelicals, they actually stood up. Two of them stood up in each church and basically said, I apologize what my faith has done to the Palestinians. And the pastor even said, yeah, when they took us there, they took us to Israel, and when we wanted to visit Bethlehem, which is obviously in the West Bank, they said, just go there, look, and come right back. Don't talk to anyone because there are a bunch of bad people around there. And the pastor said, that when he started talking to people, he realized that they were decent people, and he said they were actually the most generous people. And so there are changes there, but the main point is we cannot allow the policymakers and the media establishment to frame this as, well, it's Muslims and Jews that have been killing each other for thousands of years, and that's the problem. That's not the problem. The other significant point of that issue is Jewish history in the region. And as Bernard Lewis said in his book, The Jews of Islam, that Jews prospered copiously at the height of Islamic civilization. I mean, there was a golden age, for goodness sake. There was when they were kicked out of Spain, the Ottomans adopted the Jewish refugees as a jewel, and so this injection as if there's animus there, and I'm not saying it was perfect. Of course, there were problems, like with every empire, with every authority, there were violations, but there's nothing to the effect of persecution or atrocities. There was no Holocaust in the Middle East. There was no Inquisition in the Middle East. There was nothing like what Jews had suffered in Europe. And so making this into a Jewish-Muslim problem is really, to me, the crux of the problem in terms of allowing people to think about solutions there. Because when you frame it as that, they say, oh, okay, that's why this problem is intractable. We're not going to be able to solve it. Okay, well, let's just see how we can manage the status quo. The last thing I want to say about that is that it really is bad for American Jews and American Muslims to allow it to be framed that way, as if we're just fighting it out there, and then when there's violence against Jews here or violence against Muslims, then it makes it sound like it's the proponents of Hamas against the proponents of Benjamin Netanyahu who are fighting it out on American streets. And we know that that's the furthest from the truth. And it adds actually to anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish animus in the United States. So I just wanted to start by, debunking that myth. At the end of the day, the issue is both an international issue and a domestic issue. It does affect the way we look at Islam and at Muslims. And I remember back in 1988, when we first formed MPAC, I was brave enough to go to the California Democratic Party convention and they told me, here's, my caucus, the progressive caucus said, go and present this resolution. It was for Palestinian statehood. We wanted a declaration by the California Democratic Party, Democratic Party, to support a Palestinian state. So, what's the big deal? Well, at that time, Congressman Henry Waxman stood up and said, that is an anti-Semitic resolution. And it was voted down. So even trying to do something here, that was my first lesson of just because you think you're doing something right doesn't mean it's going to happen. And you're going to get a lot of opposition and they're going to defame you for it. And so we've been suffering from being called anti-Semitic every time. And to this day, that's exactly what's happening. We're bringing up Palestinian human rights. It is about Palestinian rights. It's about Palestinian freedom. That's really the crux of the matter. Whether you want to talk about one state, two state, BDS, how to do this, terrorism, and until and unless the United States backs up support for Palestinian freedom and Palestinian rights, the problem is not going to be resolved. And that's what it really comes down to. So when we supported it here, obviously we're called and to this day, people are called anti-Semitic. And it was interesting that the New York Times has taken a shift. It was, to me, the most significant shift in over 30 years of working on this issue, where they posted the pictures of the Palestinian children in Gaza who were killed. And Nicholas Kristof has been very vocal about it, but I'm sure you have all followed it. And he made a very important point that you just can't, we got to stop calling people anti-Semitic just because they're critical of Israeli policies. And we call this actually faith washing. Faith washing is using the vehicle of interfaith relations to suppress any sentiment for Palestinian rights. And it happens each and every time. As soon as something happens, we go to interfaith and immediately we're told, okay, we cannot really talk about Palestine. We want a ceasefire, and that's the extent of it. And so we have to check our pro-Palestinian sentiment at the door before we walk into an interfaith dialogue. And so it's about neutrality. Let's be neutral. Let's not take sides. Let's not. In other words, they don't want to deal with reality. They just want to maintain the status quo. And I think that's a big issue in our interfaith community. And in fact, our Impact DC office wrote an article about faith washing that we can send to you if you'd like to circulate it among your group to look at it a little more deeply. I think that's important. The last thing I want to say, and when you have Kamal, Abu-Shamsieh, and Estee, Chandler, they're experts on the issue. I've actually been removed from this issue since I've had so many other problems imposed upon us as American Muslims. The last thing I want to say about this issue is I believe it is groups like ICUJP that can lead our country on Palestine and Palestinian rights and ending the occupation. We have allies like Estee. We have a relationship with J Street, and I know that Estee has. Oh, you like J Street? Okay, good. I know.
I also have a relationship with them.
Great. Well, I know that some of my Palestinian partners don't like that relationship with J Street. We have to be realistic in the pro-Palestinian community, that we need Israelis and American Jewish support to work together on this issue. To make it look like, and I'm not saying that this is what's happening, but to make it look like, okay, the Muslims and the Arabs are coming in so they can wipe out the Jews, or handle the Jews or, put them under their control. That's not going to get us anywhere. And it's not right. We don't want one occupation to be removed and replaced by another occupation. And definitely, we've seen it in Iran with the revolution and the tyranny there. We don't want another religious tyranny in the Middle East. And so working with American Jews, working with Christians, working with people who are like-minded, who are speaking to the American conscience, that's the road to salvation for us. So I believe that ICJP is instrumental in that work. I'm so proud to be with you and the great work that I believe has been going on for over 30 years with many of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Salam. Estee, give us your introductory remarks, and we'll get some from Kamal, and then we'll open it up for some discussion.
Thank you so much. I just want to add to what Salam said about, ICUJP and the shoulders we stand on. And if he said it, then I apologize, I missed it, but I wanted to add George Regas to the shoulders list that we stand on.
I thought I said it, but it deserves saying twice.
Thank you. So maybe it's good if my listening ears aren't quite up to tune at the beginning of your talk. And, I came to this work quickly as a result of, I was working on a presidential campaign in 2007, 2008. There were tremendous, racism and Islam, anti-Muslim racism being thrown around. And I came out of it thinking that I really needed to understand more because of where that was coming from. I needed to understand more about what was happening in the homeland of my father, in Israel, and learn about, things I had never been taught about, like there are Palestinians and there's an occupation and this thing called Zionism that I had never heard of. And that all led me to launching the LA chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace in 2010. With that, I was asked to talk about the struggle for peace in Israel-Palestine. And the one thing that I know for sure is the struggle for peace in Palestine and Israel starts with justice. And that's what makes the Biden administration's policies towards Israel so infuriating. As Phyllis Bennis pointed out in a piece at Foreign Policy in Focus, pre-ceasefire on May 21st, but unfortunately, her key point about Biden's Israel-Palestine policy being a continuation of Trump's Israel-Palestine policy until and unless Biden actually changes it, still stands. Because Biden's done almost nothing besides talk. And sadly, that has mostly been bad news too. Peace is not something that can be imposed, as you all know well. It's a reward that communities, societies, and nations with a strong commitment to justice benefit from. And justice is certainly not a word we're hearing from Biden or his administration. It's clear that the Biden administration doesn't want to say the wrong thing. So when his press secretary, Jen Psaki, was recently asked in the White House briefing room, is it fair to say you don't want to answer the question, yes or no, whether the president feels the Israeli response has been disproportionate? Psaki forgot what George Lakoff taught us all. Once we're told not to think about an elephant, that's all we can think about. The answer is yes. Jen Psaki didn't want to answer that question. So what came out was exactly the wrong thing. We don't think, I don't think it's constructive. We are going to take everything we convey, whether it's a statement or an action, it's going to be to the end of de-escalating the situation on the ground, whatever that means. She also largely avoided a question on whether war crimes were being committed and plenty of other questions about the conflict. The conflict that the White House and the Israeli government would like us all and all Americans to think is between Israel and Hamas. But like us, it's clear that more and more Americans have stopped getting their news from mainstream media. More and more people are not buying into that Hasbara, that Israel has the right to defend itself, period. Because they know that legally and morally, Palestinians have a right to defend themselves too. Jen Psaki also didn't think that we Americans deserve to know that the Biden administration had already approved a $735 million sale of advanced weapon systems and munitions to Israel, with the bulk of that proposed sale being Joint Direct Attack Munitions, or JDAMs, which are believed to be among the very same weapons used by the Israeli military in the recent 11-day assault on the nearly 2 million human beings in Gaza. And they are mostly children. But as Jack Holmes wrote at Esquire about the White House response, quote, that would seem to be an action that sends a message about how the United States views the conflict, namely, that Israel is wielding its formidable military capabilities in a way the US deems acceptable, end quote. Meanwhile, as Stephen Colbert might say, the comedians are playing their role as faithfully as in a Shakespeare play by telling the truth. As the Daily Show host Trevor Noah said, we have to talk about it. And he suggests that one reason we have to talk about it is because of the fact that because this is a conflict that has been going on for so long, people forget that it is going on until there are what the media calls flare-ups that the world cannot ignore, that we all just witnessed. And he shed light on many events that led to Israel's most recent assault on Gaza and to the many layers of the conflict itself. Back to the founding of Israel. Not a terrible place to start. He pointed out that when one starts the report about the clashes affects who seems to be the aggressor. And he's right. If you start the story of the 2014 assault on July 8th, 2014, when Israel launched airstrikes on Gaza, followed by a ground invasion, it's clearly a story about an escalation planned and executed by Israel. But if you follow talking points delivered to media outlets by the Israeli government, the ADL, the Jewish Federation, and other organizations that comprise the Israel lobby, and you start the story on July 9th, when Hamas fired back, it's easy for viewers and listeners and readers to assume that Hamas started the escalation, and therefore, come on, let's all say it together, Israel has a right to defend itself, period. Trevor Noah ultimately suggested that we ask a different question. He said, if you're in a fight where the other person cannot beat you, how hard should you retaliate when they try to hurt you? He spoke about when he was a teenager, getting into fights with his younger brothers. His mom would tell him not to hit his kid brother back because he's 4 and you could crush him. His mom made him understand that because he had immensely more power, he needed to ask himself if his response was just. Was it necessary? Could he find a different way to deal with the conflict? Had he asked himself why his brothers were angry? And was he actually guilty of doing something? But his main question was about the power, the difference in power. And he encouraged us to think about this question. When one side has vastly more power, what is their responsibility? He also offered us an interesting reminder of a widely held perception that, quote, religion is the one thing that has never calmed any situation when there's a clash, end quote. A paradigm maybe, or for sure, many of us are positioned to help change. Then he passed the baton to John Oliver, who made a highly convincing case on Last Week Tonight, including dropping some inconvenient truths about Israel's actions as the assault went into the second week of horrors in Gaza. Oliver also pointed out that one side has suffered over 10 times the casualties, something which speaks to both the severe power imbalance at play and how that often gets obscured by how people choose to talk about it. He showed a CNN headline quoting the Israeli Foreign Ministry, translation, Ministry of Hasbara. It said that the conflict in Sheikh Jarrah is a real estate dispute. But Oliver added what CNN did not in its report, that the UN Commissioner for Human Rights made it clear that those expulsions would violate Israel's obligations under international law, and that using euphemisms like evictions are purposely misleading. He explained that Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system works really well, thankfully, protecting Israelis from rockets fired from Gaza, as well as the vast asymmetry between the two sides in weapons capabilities. Hence, the great difference in casualty rates. He reminded people that Israel's targeting civilian targets is probably a war crime, regardless of whether or not you send a heads up text to people in a building, and that when you destroy the homes and livelihoods of many, many people, and then post before and after photos on Instagram. Yes, the Israeli Defense Forces have taken to memeing their bombings, about which a prophetic John Oliver predicted, you should probably never meme a war crime. And right here, in the entertainment capital of the world, others have begun to lift the Palestine gag order that we sometimes place on ourselves, knowing that speaking out on this issue is, well, a coming out of sorts that often changes people's lives. But lest we ever forget, most importantly, the lives our speaking out can change are Palestinian lives. Devin Ivey pointed readers of the online entertainment magazine Vulture to New York Times reporting that nearly 200 Palestinians have been killed in the prior week, with more than 50 of them being children. And that over a weekend, separate Israeli airstrikes targeted a refugee camp, a high-rise building in Gaza City, which housed media organizations, including the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, as well as pointing them to comments by John Oliver and others. So while we've not gotten an honest public response to the unprecedented violence in places like Lud, Jaffa, and Haifa, or Israel's assault on worshipers inside Al-Aqsa Mosque, or peaceful protesters in Sheikh Jarrah from President Biden or his representatives, the narrative that I, along with 250 other JVP Action supporters, delivered in over 70 meetings last week alone with our congressional representatives and their advisors and staff members during our lobby week was, it just cannot be a given that the US supplies the Israeli government with nearly $4 billion in military aid every year, regardless of how that government chooses to use the weaponry that we, the American taxpayers, pay for, and how they wield the power it gives them. I would make the case for you, in fact, that America's distribution of highly advanced weapons to governments the world over, regardless of their human rights records, supercharged under the last administration, is in grave need of a review. And it's our job to make that case, both publicly and directly to our government representatives. It also means for calling for boycotts, including of companies who manufacture those weapons, companies that have a super-like grip on Congress. And it means shaking free Americans' reluctance to grapple with our responsibility as a society for supplying the tools of death and destruction now at work around the world and stamped, made in America. And there's finally a split in the Democratic Party on US policy towards Israel and Palestine. And it isn't just among politicians, it's among their voters as well. The growing divide on US policy towards Israel within the Democratic Party became even more visible in the last 2 months. And I can report it was very, very visible to the folks we were meeting with on Capitol Hill last week. Some of the party's younger, more diverse, and more progressive lawmakers have elevated questions about support for Israel and pointed to the plight of Palestinians because their constituents, us, are educating them and raising those questions. Unfortunately, President Biden has not moved to the left on this issue along with his party, in spite of the fact that a plurality of Democratic voters wants that relationship to shift. 45% of Democratic voters recently polled said they wanted the US to decrease the military aid it sends to Israel annually. The Biden administration may have quietly advocated for a ceasefire, but it was not forceful, it was not public, and they never stated what the comedians and entertainment news did, that Israel's attacks were grossly disproportionate. President Trump gave Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu nearly everything he wanted, including US recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights, moving the US embassy to Jerusalem, and a peace plan that fulfilled nearly all of Israel's wish list, but it did nothing to address Israel's occupation and siege. Trump also closed the Palestinian political office in Washington, D.C., stopped US aid to the West Bank and Gaza, and effectively cut ties with top Palestinian officials. And thus far, the Biden administration has done almost nothing to change US Israel-Palestine policy, not even to put it back where it was during the Obama administration, which was not a great place, nor was it compliant with international law and the observance of human rights. But for the most part, Biden's Israel-Palestine policy is Trump's Israel-Palestine policy. Aside from our advocacy with our senators and congressional reps, I'm urging that we need to send a message loudly and clearly to the Biden administration that the devastation of the horrific 11-day assault on Palestinians in Gaza the world just witnessed, the Israeli military carried out, was magnified by the Israeli military's brutal ongoing blockade, which has made it life unbearable for Palestinians in Gaza since 2007. And not only must members of Congress send a clear message that the US government will not support violations of international humanitarian law or war crimes, they should also publicly call for an immediate end to the illegal Israeli siege of Gaza. And of course, support all efforts for sending humanitarian aid to Gaza. Friends, we and they must recognize that aid is just a Band-Aid. We pay for the bombs Israel uses to destroy vital infrastructure, and then we pay for aid to keep the people in Gaza alive without clean running water and without more than a few hours of electricity a day, without access to healthcare, or the promise of a future, without which all they can imagine is more suffering. So we all need to call. We need to write, tweet, and text the Biden administration and our representatives with those demands as well. Israel killed over 220 Palestinians in Gaza alone during the assault, including at least 67 children. Israel destroyed schools, refugee camps, international media outlets, and roads to hospitals that they damaged, preventing the wounded from getting medical treatment. They damaged Gaza's only COVID-19 testing lab and displaced over 52,000 Palestinians, creating crisis on top of crisis on top of crisis for individuals and families, and for efforts to contain COVID-19. And they did those things using highly sophisticated weaponry that, unlike the rockets being fired at Israel, hit the intended targets every time. But even when the bombs are not falling, life in Gaza is described by Palestinians living there as unbearable. We know that life under Israel's brutal siege means severe shortages of medicine, food, electricity, and water. And Israeli medical apartheid has also denied Palestinians living under occupation access to the COVID-19 vaccine. Our laws providing accountability for what is done with the weapons and military aid we give to Israel are not consistently enforced around the globe. And in fact, they're virtually never enforced by the State Department when it comes to Israel. That's one reason why Representative Betty McCollum introduced HR 2590, the Protecting Palestinian Children and Families Act, earlier this year. The legislation is the first of its kind, designed to ensure that US taxpayer funds are not used by the Israeli government to imprison or torture Palestinian children, demolish Palestinian homes and property, or further annex Palestinian land in violation of international law. It's designed to ensure that Israel is treated the same way we believe every country should be treated, rather than receive special treatment from the State Department and US Congress, which controls the purse strings of our national budget. It's an imperative that Congress step up and ensure that American taxpayer dollars are not funding Israeli human rights abuses against Palestinians. And if you live in Southern California and your member of Congress is not Judy Chu, then they have not co-sponsored HR 2590, which has been endorsed by over 140 civil society organizations, including the Center for Constitutional Rights, JVP Action, J Street, If Not Now, Justice Democrats, the Movement for Black Lives, and the National Lawyers Guild. We should all urge our representatives to co-sponsor HR 2590 because it is the beginning of the road towards justice. HR 2590 promotes human rights, provides desperately needed government accountability and transparency, and will help create the conditions for justice and freedom for all, which one day could sow peace in Palestine and Israel, which we all know starts with justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Estee. Grace, could you moderate this next section? I have limited ability on my phone, and I would like your judgment. I wanted to be sure people know that Salam invited Mohammed Ali of MPAC to be a resource toward the end of our meeting when we talk about action items. But Grace, and I think Salam is still on by the telephone. Grace, how would you suggest proceeding?
Well, I would recommend that we let Kamal speak for a little bit, and then let's open it up to some Q&A with all three before we go to Mohammed Ali for the actual actions that we're going to take forth. What do you think?
Good plan. Kamal, please, you're welcome, and give us an update on yourself, your work, so that everybody gets to know you.
Good morning, everyone. It's really an honor to be back. This meeting that I joined Stephen and Grace and the late George Regas on September 14, 2001, in the basement of the Baptist Church, 4 days after 9/11, to start ICUJP. And it's really an honor to be back and to be among friends. As a practical theologian, we ask always the questions: what is happening? Why is it happening? And what do we need to do? And if we don't address these issues, we'll always be reacting to events. As a Palestinian whose family is still living in Ramallah and Jerusalem, I always look back on the issues and how is it affecting me personally if I'm not living there? If I'm removed from the conflict, can I be removed from it as a Palestinian who was born there? And the issue is not. It is a one-in-a-kind occupation that is immortal. We have seen many occupations that came in and went. For example, the US occupation of Iraq, even though it's reshuffling, but this occupation is different. When I was born, right before the occupation, as soon as Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, I was assigned a 9-digit military number. That number is my ID card. That is, if you look at it from an American term, your social security number that you give to any Israeli soldier upon demand. My 9-digit number, I recite in Hebrew without even hesitation. That's my identity. I thought when the Declaration of Principles back in 1993 were signed between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, that there'll be some kind of a self-rule by the Palestinians and the occupation will be on its way to finding its final days. But I was surprised to find out that the same number was transferred into all Palestinian papers. So it doesn't matter if your passport on the outside says the State of Palestine or the Palestinian Authority, the 9-digit number is still going to be the number that the Israelis will track you down. So in that sense, it is an immortal occupation. You're right. I'm not going to repeat what Estee and Salam mentioned. Yes, my sister was in Jerusalem at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the most holy time of the year. She was at the Dome of the Rock. For those who don't know it, it is designed as a mosque for women during services, especially on Fridays. And when it's the use of the space is beyond the capacity, women pray at the Dome of the Rock and men pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque. So she was at the Dome of the Rock with her daughters, and her husband and sons were at the Al-Aqsa Mosque when both places were stoned. That's basically what we continue to see on a daily basis. What is really changed in this current cycle of violence that happened are three things are important to share with you. Number one is the conflict does not start and end when the media decides to focus on it and start reporting. It does not start when the New York Times or the LA Times decides it's worthy of being covered. The conflict has been going on and the violations have been going on for years before it became known through your TV sets. The second one, today we are no longer waiting for the so-called mainstream media to tell us what's happening there. Accounts on the ground with people who are able to tweet, who are able to send videos, who are giving us instant information, so to the point that it is the credibility of the news media is in question if they continue to do the same thing. The third thing is Black Lives Matter. This movement that is an American organic movement against oppression, against racism, started to be on the forefront a year ago with the murder of George Floyd, who was killed by tactics that are used by the Israeli military to subdue Palestinians. The same tactics were taught to police departments across the country. Ultimately, George Floyd paid his life to these tactics. The linking of Black Lives Matter, of their movement to what's happening in Palestine, brought the question of Palestine into American mainstream in a different way that it has been before. So it became a popular movement, became the plight of a people. Anytime we discuss military interaction between Israel and Palestinian groups, that's when the conflict loses its steam, loses the focus on the lives of people. As people of faith, we look at one casualty is too many. I don't want to look at the people who lost their lives as numbers. One person is too many. So for us as faith communities, we look at human life different than politicians. We don't look at human lives as talking points. We look at subjecting a whole country, over 4 million people, into inhumane conditions. Ultimately, they're going to behave in an inhumane way as a reaction to ongoing policy of oppression. And the conflict did not start many centuries ago. It started in the late 40s, and it started with a military operation that took over Palestine. It did not start with a dialectic discussion or a philosophical discussion who owns the land and who was here before. It was a military operation under the eyes and the witness of the British government, who had the mandate over Palestine. Israel has a moral obligation to first recognize that what happened to Palestinians in 1947, resulting in the refugee crisis, that until today, it has not been resolved. Israel has the moral obligation to acknowledge that. So when we look at this concept of what's going to happen next, we look at, number one, 70 years of occupation did not change the aspirations of the Palestinians who live inside of Israel to say, we still remain Palestinians, even though we're living in Israel. And living as third-class citizens is unacceptable. And that basically the revolt that happened in the past month of Palestinians who are living inside Israel. So as people of faith, I join you together in what Salam and Estee mentioned of the work together. We have a history as people of faith of working together. Our first responsibility should be that we work together against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Absolutely, there is no room to have the conflict be imported into our own communities, and to take a stand that criticism of a rude country, of a regime, basically, that is staying above the rule of the law. What's happening in Palestine is not a goodwill of the Israelis to allow the Palestinians to live. We have the 4th Geneva Convention that dictates the relationship between the occupied and the occupier. And as long as that is not being upheld, we are going to see violations. And our own government is guilty of that. Maintaining a lifelong of the occupation is basically your responsibility, my responsibility as taxpayers It is our money and we are involved. So when we ask everyone to speak up, it is because our own implicit in what's going on, and it is our responsibility to change that. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for the speakers. We really need to do something and hopefully create some action and support. This is an urgent call that we need to do. I don't know how you go about this, Steve. Can we have a question and answer now, or ask a question? Are you still there?
Yes. Yes, questions and answers. And if someone can curate that, either looking at the chat box or raised hands.
Yeah, because I'm limited because I'm using my cell phone and
Grace, do you want to?
I can help you with that, Fernando. I see Michael Novick has his hand up, so I will start with him.
Okay, yes, I wanted to mention, thank you so much for the presentations, everyone, really, really important. And we had a little exchange on the ICUJP email list about this question. I am a member of UTLA, retired, and UTLA is currently considering a motion that was adopted by a couple of the area meetings urging the union to oppose further U.S. military aid because of the war crimes that have been committed, calling on Biden to stop that aid and getting the union to back the international campaign for BDS based on the call from Palestinian civil society. And so there's a lot of pushback now coming from the ADL and the Jewish Federation against that. And I wanted to urge people to, support the groups within the union. That's not going to become an official position until it's taken up by the UTLA House of Reps in September. But in the interim, there's a big campaign to try to get the union to back off and not to adopt that position. And I think it's really important for the labor movement in this country. And a number of teachers' unions have played a leading role in that. There's also a National Labor for Palestine group. Yes, I see Estee just put the JVPLA petition. We did circulate that by email, but it's there again in the chat. So I just want to say that I am a member of If Not Now, which I've sometimes been unhappy, but they're moving to the left in this question too, along with everybody else. And I think that, recognizing the extent of the apartheid system beyond just the occupation and really trying to struggle around this question. So, I think that there is a lot of movement in the Jewish community. I think the parallel to, the charge of anti-Semitism against anyone who supports Palestine is that Jews who support the Palestinian struggle and Palestinian rights are attacked as being self-hating Jews, and I think that's ridiculous. I think self-respecting people of all faiths support the human rights of the people in Palestine. So thank you very much for the presentations today, and really,
I
really
don't know
important.
if either one of you want to comment on that, or we'll just go to the next question. What do you think?
One very important piece to that, in addition, on the resolution for UTLA, is that every time we attempt a nonviolent way to demonstrate resistance, it's shot down. And then all that's left is the violent resistance. And then they they start preaching to us about nonviolence. So I think it's also, the hypocrisy of it all, of preaching nonviolence, but then, the only option then is for Israel to start launching military attacks against the Palestinians, and then some Palestinian groups like Hamas responding with their violence. So if we really are serious about nonviolence, then we have to talk about all these nonviolent forms of resistance and call them, call people out for undermining our nonviolent work.
Yeah, I think you're right, Salam. And what we also aren't hearing from Israel Palestine is all the nonviolent demonstrations that are joint with Jews and Palestinians together, right?
Yeah.
And there are so
Absolutely.
many different ways that nonviolence can, but the problem is the media doesn't cover it, right? And then we're like, exactly like you said, then we're squashed in another way.
Well, yeah.
Thanks.
And yeah, and I think, for example, when the Al-Aqsa Mosque was attacked, 75,000 people went and formed a human chain around the mosque. That's nonviolence. We don't acknowledge the nonviolence when it happens either. It's because we're so programmed to think anything that Muslims and Arabs do has to be violent.
Absolutely.
And it's those people that were trying to protect the worshipers that were violently attacked by Israeli law enforcement and soldiers with, made in the USA weapons. The one quick thing I want to say about, advocating on behalf of the UTLA thing, resolution, is that we have to continually untangle Zionism and Judaism. We have to continually say criticizing the actions of the state of Israel is not anti-Semitic, because Israel is not the Jewish people. We have to keep untangling that. When people say, oh, it makes me feel threatened because I'm a Jew, that it has nothing to do with Judaism. Anti-Semitism is hatred and discrimination against Jews because they are Jewish. Anti-Zionism is being against having a state that, occupies, that is a Jewish supremacist state, and creating it in a place where there were 1 million people doing just fine.
Good point. Thank you. Is 162843, is that Salam also or no? Who is that? If you can unmute 162843, we can take your question.
That's the code for entering the site. So I don't know.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe that's just a link to Salam. All right, let's go to Teresa then. She has her hand up.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to say thanks first to all the presenters. That was tremendous. And still looking forward to hearing from Muhammad Ali. But I especially wanted to thank Salam for lifting up the Christians in Palestine, because they don't get mentioned very often, and they are a dwindling minority. But one of the remarkable things people don't know is that unlike perhaps some other places in the region, they have a very good position in Palestinian society, and a prominent role they have had in the PLO, in the PA, in business, in many ways in Palestine. But yeah, in the context of lifting them up, I guess I wanted to mention that there are groups around the world that have become much more active in the struggle for Palestinian rights because of the Christians in Palestine, because they issued something called the Kairos Palestine document in 2009. And the group that I'm most active with, United Methodist Kairos Response, is responding to that document and that movement. And it's become a worldwide movement. So that wasn't a question, sorry. I just wanted to say thank you to Salam and amplify a bit of what he had to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Teresa. And actually, I think maybe if there's time, we can ask Daryl to tell us what's come out of Bethlehem. He circulated a video from the president of Bethlehem Bible College speaking to the point, of Christians there. But I want to be respectful of those who have their hands up. And I was told that Genevieve Marcus has had her hand up. I don't see it. So Genevieve, do you want to go?
Yes, I, of course, understand and agree with everything that's been said, but there is one question. What if everything that was said was reversed. What if United States eliminated all their support of Israel? Then what would we have? Then we would have, would they be equal, the Palestinians and Israelis? There are far more Palestinians than Israelis, so they would outnumber them. And there would be, Arab states to support them, possibly. So, and what we hear from the Palestinian leadership is that their mission is to destroy and eliminate all of Israel. And so would that be the reverse? And is that what we're asking for?
So that question should be lobbed over to Kamal, and we'll let you take a stab at it. And then if Salam wants to add to it, that's good. Thank you, Genevieve.
Thank you so much for the question. Absolutely not. When we ask for equality for everyone who's living there and justice, we're looking at the power dynamic. Today Israel is a threat to all the countries of the region, and it's a threat to the Palestinians themselves.
Right.
It's not the other way around. That's number one. Number two, the rule of the law is what we're looking for. We're not looking to take sides with one person or one group over the other. International law needs to be in place. In that sense, when we look at a Palestinian state, it should live side by side next to Israel with respect to all of its citizens, whether they are Muslims, Jewish, Christians, practicing, non-practicing. So this issue of let's suspend Palestinian rights, Palestinians living in dignity, out of fear of what will happen to the occupier, I think it's not something that we would like to begin with, because their rights, their lives have been suspended over 70 years. Out of the fear of the occupier to say, if I give up power, what will happen to me? Well, you know what? You can become like South Africa, and you will lose power, and the people who are indigenous will live in peace, and you live to live with them or get out of the place.
That isn't what they're saying, though. That is not what Hamas and others.
That is what's happening on the ground. Is Israel is turning into an apartheid state. And if we don't take steps to undo that, it is for the Israelis' best interest to solve the problem and end the occupation. We'll not leave it up to politicians who are benefiting from it on the expense of the future generations. Power is addictive. And as long as people are using and abusing power, in that sense, we should take power from them and put it back into the people. If there are more Palestinians living than Israelis and if it's a one state, then it would be the democratic process. If there are two states, well, each one in their own territory. So that's not be an issue. But the premise that we should suspend justice out of fear of what will happen to the occupier, that is not a premise for justice.
So thank you, Kamal, for that response. Salam, do you want to add to that? Or Estee?
Yeah, I'll just say that no Palestinian leader has called for the destruction of Israel. The Palestinian nonviolence resistance movement is asking just, for what is international law, which is to end the illegal military occupation and the siege of Gaza, to take down the apartheid wall, to give what Palestinian citizens of Israel, something Israel very racistly calls Israeli Arabs, just to try to wash away the existence of Palestinian people in their history. And of course, that they be given the right to return. The right to return is something that every human being on the face of the earth has a right to. It's international law that if you're driven out or if you flee in fear for your safety in war, that you can come back to your home. And Israel has prevented that now since, 1949.
It's interesting that you have not heard, I have read numerous times that the Palestinian leaders, not the ones that you are talking about, but like Hamas and so forth, the violent ones, are definitely, they want to destroy and eliminate Israel altogether. This is their mission. And I'm amazed to hear that you haven't heard that.
Well, I think it's because we get our information from different places, Genevieve. I encourage you to read Jewish Currents. I encourage you to read people like Peter Beinart, who is is an academic. He uses history. He talks from a place of reality. Unfortunately, many people get their information from organizations that are perpetuating conflict, like the ADL, that are, advocating for violence against Muslims and Black people. We need to look at where we get our information so that we can understand the reality that is actually happening there on the ground. Check out Jewish Voice for Peace.
Yeah, I think, Estee, you make a valid point, because we do hear erroneous stuff. I know that from Latin America. We only hear a certain voice in the US media. But I want to now, so Genevieve, keep plugging in and check other sources, and let's keep at this so that we get an accurate information. And I'm going to turn to Steve Rohde now, and then I'm going to ask Mohammed to jump in after Steve puts his question, so that we have time to hear your responses and actions that you're asking for us, if that's okay. All right, Steve, go for it.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Let me start by posing this to Kamal, and I'm eager for others to respond. There are accusations that the Palestinian leadership is weak, is not a partner with whom peace can be negotiated. I'm using phrases from mainstream media and elsewhere. That Hamas has an unwarranted influence in Gaza, that the Hamas charter speaks of destroying Israel. So, Kamal, you did speak of a Palestinian state existing in peace. Peter Beinart has lost patience with the two-state solution. Have you? And if not, if you see the future being a Palestinian state with sovereignty and safety, then what does the leadership on the Palestinian side look like right now?
That's an important question. Thank you so much. They have to differentiate between leaderships and the people on all sides. The same way we differentiate between the current American administration and you, because it will be unfair to judge people by their leaders. We know what leadership can do. They hijack power, and they always without checks and balances. When we look at the current Palestinian leadership, whether be it Hamas, whether be it the Palestinian Authority, each one is serving a purpose, and each one is looking at the conflict to be manipulated in their own ways. Let's not forget that Israel itself is what helped create Hamas to be the Hamas that is today, when they went after the national Palestinian movement in the early 70s. I was still living in Palestine when the labor union was under attack, when the student unions were under attack, and the Muslim Brotherhood was allowed to organize, bring money from out of the country, and become the Hamas that it is today. So in a way, look at what the CIA did with the Al-Qaeda and what happened to us here. Let's differentiate between bad products of bad policies and the people themselves. The Palestinians will rise against Hamas as they did in the past. They're rising against the Palestinian Authority now because of corruption. That is a question to be left to the Palestinians, what to do and who are your leaders. The same way when the uprising of 1987 took place, it went without the permission of the Palestinian Authority. It's an organic movement of the people living under occupation. And I don't want to underestimate the power of the people when they rise up. And they can and should be trusted and should be supported in choosing their own leadership. That discussion cannot be happening today as long as there is an occupation, as long as there are laws that makes nonviolent resistance illegal, to the point that pushing direction for a military intervention. Time there is violence militarily, the Palestinians will lose because they will look at it as a conflict between two equal sides, and which the issue is not. So we should go back to the United Nations and ask for the protection of the people in Palestine under occupation, because it should not be left for the Israelis to protect them. They are not protecting them. And when you do that, consider having a democratic elections, and the people in Palestine should elect their own leaders, whether they are acceptable to foreign governments or not. And only then we can start to live democracy the way we know it and practice it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Mohammed now. You may comment on that same or any of the other questions, and also tell us some of your thoughts and actions that we should take.
I appreciate everyone's thoughts and their.
Well, you're not coming through, Mohammed.
Can you guys hear?
Now we can. Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I appreciate everyone's thoughts and their perspective. Having the sort of institutional knowledge that you all possess is that kind of insight is just, it's unrivaled. Salam mentioned that you all have been at it for as a coalition, I think, since the early 90s, and obviously as individuals, perhaps before then. I just wanted to highlight something that has changed pretty dramatically in just a matter of a few years. When I started on Capitol Hill, this was January of 2010, a lot of what is kind of part of the public discourse would have been unfathomable, unimaginable. Elected officials showing support for things that they are, obviously Betty McCollum, among others, and I wanted to highlight her because I'm from, the western suburbs of Minneapolis, and Ilhan Omar specifically as well. I went to the University of Minnesota and was actually the first time I had a chance to vote, it was for Keith Ellison. So that was, very, very, really, really appreciated that. But part of the reason I think that there has been is because there is a new generation of individuals who have been watching and following this, and this is reflected in who they vote for. They want to see this as this is part of their voting platform. Whereas before there perhaps wasn't as much energy behind these, and I don't mean from it's from everyday voters. This was not on the top of their on top of their agenda, and so I think that shift has changed, and it seems like a lot of folks who are now being elected to the House of Representatives, specifically they're of a younger generation, and this is something that they've been watching and is near and dear to their hearts. And the way that and this kind of speaks to, I think, what was being discussed before is what are Arab leaders saying and what is being spoken about in terms of the foreign policy of individual countries. Can you guys all hear me? Okay, perfect. What are they saying? Are they talking about, some of the more extreme positions in, vis-a-vis Israel and its future? And there is obviously a misinformation campaign. There is obviously a desire to kind of minimize what a lot of the, media coverage is coming out from the reality of what's happening on the ground. But I think that's also being countered by individuals who are showing what's actually happening on things like TikTok, things like Instagram, tweeting about it. So there are more media outlets that people are getting information from. It's not dominated exclusively by CNN or Fox News and what is being shown by them. So I think that that really has had a good degree of changing the shift of how people are talking about it. One thing that I wanted to mention, just from a congressional aid and an outside perspective, in terms of lobbying, I like Salam said, I spent about 6 years as an advisor to Senator Al Franken, and part of my portfolio there was national security and foreign policy. And after that, I did a good about 4 years in advocacy and lobbying. Only part of that was on national security and foreign policy. Simply asking a member of Congress or their aides to say, well, what is your complete ban on any money going to Israel? Those kinds of things, they're so sweeping and declarative that it's easy for their staff and the members themselves to say, no, that's sort of a ridiculous position, even though many people would be supportive of it, because it's just maybe too extreme. Maybe there isn't enough backing, or maybe there's just not enough upside for the member to take that road. If you instead then focus on what is existing in, what is codified in US law, then asking them, putting them on the record to say, well, why is it that you're allowing these funds to be transferred, whereas we have in our law, the prevention of those funds, the prohibition of those funds. And obviously I'm specifically talking about the Leahy law, which prevents US taxpayer dollars to be sent to be provided to other foreign military apparatuses and security agencies, and it specifically says that they cannot be in violation of human rights laws or human rights. And then ask the member of Congress, well, would you want to do you think that U.S. funding should be blocked? And if yes, that's wonderful. That's wonderful that you are in opposition to that. And if no, well, then define what you consider to be a violation of human rights. Because what has happened there is an obvious violation of human rights. So ask them why that is, according to your definition, okay, for example. So you really can put them in a corner and ask them in point blank, why is what is happening not a violation of human rights? That is likely a more effective advocacy mechanism rather than just, a broad general sweeping statement of no funding for Israel, or no, let's just sort of totally reshape our foreign policy to Israel. It's likely not going to happen in that way. I strongly believe that might be the most effective and most immediate step to be taken. Obviously, asking your member of Congress to co-sponsor HR, I think it's 2590, or the Betty McCollum bill is a wonderful step, and that also it requires them to put them in a position to say yes, or 2590, put them in a position to say yes, we will support, which is wonderful, or no, we won't support. And then you have to ask, well, why not? You can say that we respect your position, you're an elected official, but tell us why. And members of Congress and their staff need to know that there is an upside to being supportive of these ideas, and that there also is going to be an electoral downside to some of these. You're not going to be able to get out the vote, or you're not going to, there's going to be money that is going to be withheld. It's just a matter of being more politically engaged. And I think that there might have been a generational shift, whereas 25 years ago, maybe there wasn't as many individuals that were engaged with this specific issue. Obviously, on the other side, when it comes to AIPAC, they've been very powerful, but it also requires a case study as to how have they been so effective at doing that. And that is because that they have a really good grassroots game, that they've been very effective at fundraising, and they were the only individuals, they were the only game in town. They were the ones who had dominated that sphere. But I think that they have now aligned themselves with the Republican Party now, far more than before, that they were sort of more of a bipartisan group, that there wasn't anybody that was in opposition at a sort of an establishment level. I think that has changed, and I think that is effective. And I think that the shift really took place when the House of Representatives, I think it was Paul Ryan, invited Benjamin Netanyahu to speak before Congress against the wishes of the Obama administration. And this was largely to oppose the JPOA. And that was something that I had been working quite a bit on. In fact, I had an opportunity to work with with J Street and a few other organizations. This was sort of at the end of my time with Senator Al Franken. And there has been a shift in politics when it comes to, AIPAC and J Street among Democrats. So I think that is something that, Democrats can capitalize on. And I'm just looking through some of the, so it doesn't, JPOA is the Iran nuclear deal, which the Trump administration had gotten out of. Estee, you said that which doesn't withhold aid, but it makes sure that U.S. does not use to counter U.S. law. And so that specific bill, I think, revolved around the $750 million that was going to Israel, or I think maybe that was the Bernie Sanders bill in the Senate side. But regardless, the Leahy law is the law. It's on the book. So are you, again, how does a specific member of Congress, how do they define what human rights are? And how do you define what a violation is? Obviously, what we all saw during that 11-day siege, it is clear as day that there were human rights violations being committed on an hourly basis, on a minute-by-minute basis. And if members of Congress they don't believe that was human rights, a human rights violation, then we have to ask, what does it take for something to become a human rights violation? If they're going to, war crimes, I mean, what is their definition? And they can't then kind of pivot to say, well, it is in the best interest of our ally to not go down this route. And you can say, okay, fine, sure, fine. Let's concede the point for just a second that it was an essential act. But then you go back to them and say, then you tell me what is your bosses or the member themselves, and say, well, what is your definition of human rights? If you were to remove that idea, separate the idea from on the ground reality, on the ground politics and military strategy, ask them point blank, what is it? I know we've got a number of questions, so I will allow our moderator to maybe kick it to the folks who want to ask questions.
Thank you so much. You're super helpful. I'm almost thinking we need to get you back so you can do some training for us. So very good. Thank you so much. I see Joe and Stephen Fisk, and those will be, and then Kamal is thanking Mohammed there. Joe, do you want to go first? And then Stephen, let's make them short questions, please. So that we're going to end our time with Steve Rohde's reflection, which I think will be a really excellent way to move us into the next part of our lives after ICUJP. So Joe and then Stephen Fisk. And then excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Joe, but let's have both of you give your questions and then we'll see who will answer them, okay? Go for it, Joe. Joe?
Hello. Yeah. I hope this works. I'm having a little internet trouble. The first is this right to defend yourself. I only wish that the Israeli government were doing it instead of doing the stuff that is doing, which is the equivalent, by the way, it helped sponsor, and I wonder if there's some comment on this, in hopes that it would be an opposite to the political opposition by the PLO. Sounds a lot like the U.S. sponsoring the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Second point I want to make is a couple of factors about the U.S. government involvement. One is this money is the money goes actually to the U.S. arms manufacturers. A lot of it. It's part of that rot that we deal with, or we try to deal with. And another point is, I'd like to hear about this level of discussion. So far, it's been impossible for the U.S. political culture to resist paying for a reenactment of the U.S. conquest of North America, which has not been repented and it's not been made amends for, and it continues to haunt the U.S. policies and sponsor or repeat the same kind of atrocities, displacement, and addiction to violence. That's something that I think we ought to bring to the surface and confront, because it's a U.S. being haunted, and Israel as just a kind of a reenactment of it to be sponsored. I'd love to hear speakers talk about that point.
That's a very good point to bring it right to us here at home, right? Let's take Stephen Fisk's Stephen Fisk's question, and then let Estee and Kamal respond.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good, okay. Thank you for this beautiful and educational morning. It's been great to have this dialogue. I want to bring up a point that I don't think has been talked about, and that is that Israel is not really a democracy. We think of Israel as democracy, but it's really kind of a religious tyranny where the Orthodox right controls policy in Israel. And as a result, there's been very little that the peace movement has been effective. There is pluralism in Israel. There is a peace movement in Israel and Palestine. And very little has been talked about in this discussion this morning about the peace movement and what it can do as we're moving forward. We've got to break down the patriarchal, top-down, hierarchical governance that dominates both the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Knesset has 120 members, but on an average, less than 25 over the years have been women. And there are women's movement, more than 50% of the population in Israel is women. And there are movements in Israel where Israeli and Palestinian women are coming together to in a very powerful movement for peace. So I just want to see what the speakers today, what kind of emphasis they would put on the active peace movements that have been ongoing in Israel and in the United States, and what they think of what they can do. I know we've all been frustrated. I've been thinking about, how we marched and protested against the Iraqi war as Colin Powell went before the United Nations and lied, and we all felt betrayed. So there's a certain amount of frustration, certainly, that we as peacemakers feel.
Okay, thank you, Stephen, for bringing up that point. I'm going to turn it to Estee and Kamal to respond to both of these issues. One about how the U.S. has to not forget to take the log out of its own eye when we talk about the wrongs that are being conducted elsewhere, and we continue to live off the wrongs we conduct. And then the issue of the peace movement, and particularly women in the peace movement. So Estee, I'll let you go first. Oh, sorry, Mohammed.
Oh, I was going to say, if I can get a chance to speak to that as well after the other folks have gone.
Okay, there, good for you. Okay, I'm sorry, Mohammed, please, my apologies. All three of you, I'll let Estee go first since she's a woman, and Stephen just talked about that. And then I'll let then Kamal and Mohammed, you both address these issues, okay? Estee. And we're gonna just do it briefly because we don't have a lot of time left, okay? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to answer the question, what can we do? Look, we are all seeking to change US policy. The way to do that is to engage with policymakers, as Mohammed was talking about. We have to engage, we have to make our voices heard. I'll let Kamal and Mohammed take on the points that who made it? Joe made. But I will say that, the problems that Zionism has wrought on the Middle East are man-made problems. And what that means is that women can fix them. And I'll pass the mic on to Kamal or Mohammed.
Thank you, Estee, for saying that. I remember being in the West Jerusalem with Women in Black who used to join every single week demonstrating the occupation. Let's not forget the Memorial Day and what women historically did to stop men from going to war. Yes, the power of women is recognized and in place, and I celebrate and I join you. It's an honor for me as a man to walk with you and to support you and get empowerment from you as well. At the same time, we're going to look at the movement of what people can do, be it men and women versus policy. So we have to always recognize that there is a limit to change and how we can effect change. Ultimately, we need people like Mohammed who will advise us what the policy will look like and how we can translate our voices into action. Because we have been saying these things, we have been demonstrating in the streets, but as they say it, if it falls on deaf ears of our elected officials, or maybe we're not saying what the language that they want us to say, let's hear it from Mohammed. Please help us.
I was going to say, just I think it's Voltaire who said, "Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good." Obviously, we want significant change. We want to totally make things, totally transform lives for Palestinians, for those in the West Bank, for Gaza. But it's going to take a lot of time to get there. It's going to require incremental change. Right now, the baseline, we all know what the baseline is. That's the status quo. That's what has been going on for a very long time. It's going to take a while to get there. I don't want anybody to think that that's going to change overnight. I don't want anybody to be disheartened that it hasn't, or people to feel like the actions have been a failure. I don't want to say this to kind of say that there has been good and upward movement, but the fact that members of Congress and everyday individuals and people in mainstream media are talking the way that they are, that was unfathomable during the last time this happened. That is a result of folks like all of you, because you have been at this for such a long time. It is only going to get better because, like Estee said, we vote with our money. We're able to, politicians are aware that there are going to be fundraising and there are going to be ramifications to vote in a certain, if they don't vote in a certain way, or if they take certain positions, that means that they can't fund their campaigns as well as they would like, that their own constituency is going to be, that they're going to be less inclined to vote for them. And while in a lot of Republican districts and Republican states, that it may not change that much, but I think that the main change could come in Democratic primaries. AOC primaried her predecessor, and that's how she won. Rashida Tlaib also, I believe, primaried her predecessor. Cori Bush, I believe, also primaried the member of Congress who was in that seat. All of these were Democratic areas, and I'm not suggesting that we go in primary. I'm not saying that we should take a position on that, nor am I suggesting MPAC does. I'm just saying we need to make sure that Democratic lawmakers, liberal Democratic lawmakers, members of the Progressive Caucus, they know that there are constituents who hold this as their primary issue. And if they don't vote or they don't speak about this in a certain way, that there's going to be electoral ramifications. Even if they're sort of silent on the issue, what in and of itself is a victory. In years past, Democrats were, ferociously pro-Israel when it came to a lot of their actions. This time around, many Democrats, even in the Senate, were peculiarly silent on the issue, which, if you think about it, is in and of itself a policy shift change. Now, next time around, they may be in opposition, right? So I think we need to also sort of look at that as a slight win. Again, what is happening is horrible. What is happening is terrible. I'm not saying that we take that as a victory, but I think it's important to understand that this is the change that is already taking place. And that is because there has been a recognition of our votes, of our action taken. And younger folks are using things like TikTok and Instagram and Twitter to share with the rest of the world the atrocities that are being committed. And I don't say that to say that none of us use TikTok or Instagram, but Twitter and Instagram, but TikTok has sort of like shown the world what has been happening.
Really good. Thank you so much to all three of you. And Salam, please convey our thanks to him, Mohammed. We will do it by email, but we want to really recognize how fruitful this discussion has been and so important. And, you know, we need to keep talking and keep informing each other and keep telling us what we need to do. And I'm also thinking that, Anthony, we need to schedule Daryl and Randy Heinlam to have a time where Christians in Palestine can have a voice, you know, at ICUJP. We've done that before, but not so explicitly. And so the Kairos Palestine group that Daryl is just holding up there, we need to schedule that in as well.